My parents owned a cabin in the woods of Pennsylvania that we would always go and stay every summer for roughly 2 to 3 weeks. This was the summer of 2015, and my family had planned our annual trip to the cabin. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and set off on the long drive from our home in New Jersey to the secluded spot of Pennsylvania. This journey took roughly 4 hours, but it felt like an eternity as I was stuck in the back seat with my younger sister. She was always obnoxiously full of energy and could never sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. So to pass the time, we played games like I Spy and tried to spot interesting things along the way. When we finally arrived, it was later in the afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to get ready to set for the evening. My parents quickly unpacked the car while my sister and I explored the area around the cabin. We found a small creek nearby where we had spent some time splashing around trying to catch frogs. Afterward, we headed back to the cabin just in time for dinner. My mom had just finished cooking up some burgers on the grill, and we had that outside. Very quickly the night fell, and we would gather around the fire pit roasting marshmallows. My dad always had a knack for trying to scare us kids. He would tell us about the legend of the Mothman, a supposed mysterious creature said to roam the woods and forest of Pennsylvania all the way down to Virginia. Now, according to him, this thing was a large, winged creature with glowing eyes. It was supposedly able to communicate with humans through telepathy, often causing feelings of fear and dread to those who had encountered it. As my dad spun his tale, my sister and I would huddle close together, feeling frightened but also fascinated. After my dad got done telling the story, we decided to call it a night. We already had a long day of driving. We headed inside the cabin and got ready for bed. But the story really stuck with me, and it freaked me out. So I sat there awake in my bunk, just nervous and listening to the sounds of the frogs and forest outside. I could hear the wind blowing, and even the distant hooting of an owl. And very slowly over time, I just started to drift off to sleep. But I thought I heard something else. A faint screeching noise, like metal scraping against metal. Now the next morning, I told my family about the strange noises I had heard all during the night. But my dad laughed and dismissed it as just how windy it was last night. My sister was very intrigued. She even suggested we go exploring to see if we can find any signs that supposedly it was the Mothman. Well, I took her up on the offer because I wasn't about to sit and hang out with my boring parents. So we spent a good portion of the morning hiking through the woods, following any loose game trails we could and trying to look for anything out of the ordinary, really. At one point, we stumbled upon a small area where the ground was covered in what I would call large, unusual footprints. Now, it was hard to tell exactly, but they looked almost bird-like, much larger than any bird we'd ever seen. And so we kept hiking, and then we came across a very large tree with really deep scratches all over the trunk. Now, I know bears are more than capable of doing this, but this just seemed different, if that makes any sense. The claws were different. This made us both feel extremely excited and nervous. We figured we should tell our parents about what we found. We were not thinking anything in the realm of monsters, though, at this point. So we took the mile-long hike back to the cabin and told our parents what we'd found. We'd even shown them some cool leaves we got and some broken branches, and of course they humored us and agreed that it was probably the Mothman's den. When I started to try and get serious with my father, he got really skeptical, telling me that the whole Mothman thing is just an old legend, that he doesn't really believe it exists. Well, anyway, fast forward to that night, and we're sitting around the fire pit once again. But I couldn't help but discuss the possibility that Mothman might be real. Of course, my sister and I's imaginations ran wild as we speculated about what it would actually look like and where in the woods it would live. Would it live up in a nest? Would it live down underground? Would it live in caves? Now, as we're talking and getting excited, I hear that same screeching noise from the night before. But this time, it was much louder and much closer, making me stop mid-sentence. Everybody, my mom, my dad, my sister, and I, fell completely silent as we could hear this metal-on-metal noise echoing through the trees. And not even a second later, this large shadow passed overhead, momentarily blocking out the light of the moon. When we all looked up, we caught a glimpse of something massive with wings soaring above us. And I'm telling you now, this was not an owl, it was much larger. As it passed overhead, it let out this horrendous screech, one that reminded me of metal scraping against metal, like I've said. But it also sounded like pain and frustration. Without even a word, all in unison, we quickly run into the cabin, locking the doors and windows behind us. We huddled together, and of course I was beyond freaked out, but I couldn't help but wonder if we just had our own encounter with the Mothman. My dad told us to go to the room now, so we did, and I could hear my mom and him out there talking and whispering, although they sounded pretty panicked. Eventually, me and my sister fell asleep huddled together on the bed, scared, contemplating what it was that we saw that night. The next morning, I remember my father budging me to wake up, telling me that we're going to go ahead and leave, that it's not safe to be up here. My parents seemed unusually serious and stoic. They're usually the pretty joyful type, so it was very out of character. Looking back, maybe they knew something I did not. And after that, we really didn't exchange a lot of words. I grabbed my backpack and supplies, my sister grabbed her things, and within about an hour or two's time, we had the car fully packed and we were driving back home. Now again, we also didn't exchange a whole lot of words on the entire ride home. We were also exhausted and tired, but for whatever reason, there was at least 2 times I tried to bring up last night. The first time, my father didn't say anything. The second time, my father just completely changed the subject, like it was some taboo subject we do not talk about. Very, very weird. A couple months later, I tried to bring up the subject again. My father just laughed and said, "Oh, it was just a really huge barn owl." But I don't know. Remembering back, it didn't look like an owl at all. Look, I'm not saying that what we saw was the Mothman, but it was definitely exceptionally large. I think larger than a man, and it had wings, whatever it was. I'm sure you are already trying to write me off as just a simple misidentification, but the noises this thing made was not normal. It was unlike any wildlife I've ever known or heard of. So I'll let you be the judge on what you think this could have been. I lived in Pennsylvania for the majority of my life. And in 2009, I started talking to this really cute girl on Facebook. Well, about 6 months goes by and we start dating. But the only problem was that she lived in New York. So I would have to often travel to see her. I even remember the first time I visited her. It was in October. And it was evening as I was pulling into the driveway. Now, as soon as I stepped out of my car, I could feel that something was off. You know that feeling where you could just tell that something in the atmosphere isn't right? Well, that's what it was. I brushed off the feeling, walked up to the front door, excited to see my girlfriend. And she greeted me with a warm smile and hug, instantly making me feel at ease. We spent the evening talking, watching movies, and just hanging out. Now that night, it was decided that I would sleep in the guest bedroom. Since her parents were pretty conservative, and they did not approve of us sharing a bed. By the way, I was 21 at the time, and she was 20. She was just starting college, so she still lived at home with her parents. Her father was a contractor, and so he was pretty loaded. They had a really nice house, a huge piece of property which backed up along a ton of woods, which, by the way, I think it was the Allegheny National Forest, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, the guest room was located down a long hallway, away from the rest of the bedrooms. So as I settled into bed, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the house was. It was almost suffocating. But I was in relative good spirits, and so I laid down and tried my best to shut my brain down. You know how it can be sometimes when you're trying to fall asleep. The only issue is that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That same feeling I had again when I got out of the car initially. But this time it was worse, like somebody was watching me from in the room. Obviously, the room was pretty empty. There was an open closet, a small dresser, and the bed. It was a guest bedroom after all, so I couldn't expect there to be much. The silence of the house, though, just seemed to amplify the feeling. Above me was the creaking floorboards, and I could hear her parents moving back and forth the hallway. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, and I'm pretty sure I had woken up at some point in the night to heavy breathing outside or in the room. I couldn't quite discern where or what. Anyway, the next morning, I woke up and we had a relatively good morning. I even shared my unease to my girlfriend over breakfast. She laughed it off, saying that she had grown up in that house and had never experienced anything strange, thinking I was hinting at it being haunted, which I wasn't. Her parents even agreed, and they thought it was weird too. They assured me it was probably just a change of environment, and that maybe I was tired or my mind was playing tricks on me. But despite their reassurances, I couldn't help but feel this lingering feeling. It was the sense of dread, and it hung with me all day. We spent the majority of our time indoors. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. Heavy rain poured down, and a thick fog enveloped the land around us. So finally that evening, we were getting a little stir-crazy. We decided to take an advantage of a break in the rain and go for a walk through the woods behind our house. So we went for a walk, and we noticed the fog growing denser, the air colder. The trees almost seemed to close in around us. And at times at our hike, our conversation would gradually fade, and we would both become lost in our thoughts. I could tell that something strange was going on. My girlfriend's demeanor began changing, like she could sense something was wrong, although I'm not sure what, at least not yet. I also noticed that the sounds of the forest were also not present. There was just this stillness around us. We hadn't gone very far at all, maybe a mile at most, and that's really pushing it. We decided that maybe we should head back before it got too dark. As we began to turn around on this loop and head back, I immediately sensed that we were being followed. I stopped my girlfriend and asked her, "Hey, does anyone live around here? Do you have any neighbors?" And she looked at me strangely and said, "No. Why?" And immediately, I could feel the presence of something moving in on us very quickly. So I pulled her hand up to me and I whispered to her, "I think there's someone following us." Immediately, her eyes watched something off to my left. I could tell she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. But when I turned to look where she was looking, there was nothing there. We both decided to quickly move towards the house. We pretty much double-timed it back to the house. The sense of being watched only intensified as her house came into view. My heart was racing, and I'm sure hers was as well. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My body was reacting to something. Even my girlfriend was grabbing my hand and squeezing it. We reached her backyard, and I did breathe a sigh of relief. The familiar sight of her home seemed to dispel some of the fear that had been building inside me, while at the same time, it was becoming worse, if that makes any sense. We hurried inside, eager to escape the cold and dampness. And her parents looked at us strangely while we were pretty much running in the house. And we just said we were ready to get in and be warm. We sat on the couch and just started conversation, trying not to talk about what we had just experienced, if really anything. We then had dinner with her parents, and we pretty soon forgot about our adventures out in the woods. Next thing you know, bam, it's 11:30 p.m. and I am exhausted. So my girlfriend kisses me goodnight, and she's going to stay up and read a little bit. So I head back down to the guest bedroom, and I get ready to crash out for the night. I couldn't help but replay the events of our walk through the woods. The silence, the feeling of being watched, and something moving toward us. It was unnatural, and sleep eluded me. I felt like I tossed and turned for hours. And maybe at some point, I can't tell if I had drifted off to sleep or not, I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming downstairs. I immediately jumped out of bed, raced down the hallway towards the source of the noise. As I rounded the corner into the living room, I saw my girlfriend's father standing by the shattered glass. He was holding a baseball bat and his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" I asked. He looked at me and looked back at the shattered window. He explained he heard something outside like heavy footfall, and then this window just exploded. We quickly checked on my girlfriend and her mom, who were both understandably shaken but unharmed. I helped her father survey the damage, and we noticed large prints leading away from the house into the woods. Immediately, her father called the police, and they searched the surrounding area for any signs of an intruder. But of course, they found nothing. They ultimately concluded that it must have been some sort of freak accident or that there truly was an attempted break-in. They also let him know to call them if there was any more incidents. Now, I couldn't help shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us in the woods was responsible for the shattered window. The rest of my visit passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not fully comfortable in that house again. Here's the other kicker. The tracks that were leading away from the house up into the woods were not boot prints or shoe prints. They were barefoot, and larger than anyone I've ever seen. Probably size 16 or 17, if we had to guess. Now, we didn't get down there on all fours and thoroughly examine the prints, but you could tell they were bare footprints. I still have no way to explain that one. Now, over the years, my girlfriend and I eventually drifted apart and eventually separated in 2013. But every so often, I find myself thinking back to that bizarre weekend at her family's place near that forest. It definitely stands out as one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. When I was 16 years old, my family moved in town to this huge house right up against the Allegheny National Forest. Things were fine for the most part, but the house and that property gave me the flippin' creeps. It was kind of this old Victorian-style mansion that had been renovated and fixed up and changed all throughout the years. My parents loved it, but I could never shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I was never a kid that believed in the paranormal or haunted houses, but this place definitely took the cake. It didn't help that we were also surrounded by thick, old woods. It definitely had a creepiness factor to it. Not to mention, I remember when we moved in, my father had talked about witches being burned out here, Back during the Salem witch trials. As if the place wasn't creepy enough. I remember things started happening only a few weeks after we moved in. There was one evening I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard this strange noise coming from right outside my window. It sounded like someone or something was scratching at the glass. I tried my best to ignore it, thinking it was just a tree branch or some animal, but the sounds persisted. I got out of bed, walked over to the window, peering through the curtains, and that's when I saw it. There was a pair of glowing eyes that were staring back at me. They were yellow but seemed to be floating in midair. I froze on the spot, not knowing what to do. And suddenly, the eyes almost melted into nothing. And immediately after, I heard this loud boom coming from the roof. I freaked, running out of my room, down the hall to my parents' bedroom, screaming in hysteria and waking them up. They heard my story but were pretty visibly agitated that I had woke them up over my ridiculous ghost tale. My mother kept explaining that it was just a nightmare and I needed to go back to bed. She had work early the next morning. I was extremely frustrated and defeated, to say the least. And I don't know how I eventually fell back asleep, but I did. So the next morning, I went outside to investigate, and I found scratch marks on the side of the house leading up to my window. But there were also footprints in the mud below. But they were like dog prints, not footprints. They were also very large and could only make out about 3 toes. I have no idea if that indicates anything or if that helps you as the reader, but that's just what I found. And weird stuff like that would continue to happen every time I was outside playing or hanging with my friends, but especially every time I was near the woodline. I would catch glimpses of something large moving, and when I would turn to look, there was nothing there. So after a time, I just began to ignore it altogether, figuring it was just my imagination. Now, I remember that spring in particular. I want to say late April or early May, because by this point, a lot of the foliage had grown back, and the flowers were in full bloom, and it was getting near the end of the school year. And so a few friends and I thought it would be a great idea to go camping in the woods right near the house. I mean, it was perfect. There was a few of us, we had a tent. We were only a few 100 feet away from the house, so if we needed anything, everything was right there. And God forbid something goes wrong, we could always crash out in the family room. And so that evening in question, I invited my friends over. We played some games and played some card games. We went outside and played Army, and then we decided to gather up all of our equipment and head off into the woods, but not too far away. Close enough that we could still see the house, but a good spot to where we could set up our tent. We started getting everything set up and even kind of dug out a small makeshift fire pit. And I'll never forget this. As me and my buddy Jerry were putting stones around the makeshift fire pit, we all froze when we heard it. It sounded like a flipping lion roaring, not even 50 to 100 feet away, deeper in the woods. We all shot up, glanced in the direction the noise came from, and then looked back at ourselves. I remember my other friend Tom, with wide eyes, saying, "What was that?" And I'm here to tell you right now, it was not a bear roaring. We have black bear on that property. I have been around bear several times in my life. I've heard their noises. This sounded far more dangerous and menacing than anything I've ever heard or known. And one thing we noticed, instantly after that roar, everything around us went incredibly silent. Not a single noise. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. I think we all decided as a group at that point to just abandon camp and run back towards the house, because that's exactly what we did. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this was in the afternoon, so there was still plenty of daylight out. But when we went back in the house, it wasn't until later in the evening, as the sun was just about all the way down, that we realized, oh crap, the tent and all of our camping gear, we can't just leave it out there. Somebody, all of us, have to go back to grab it. The tent was still partially even put up, and that tent and equipment was my own father's. He would be beyond livid if we just left it out there to get damaged or who knows what. None of us wanted to go back there and fetch it, but we knew we had to. So we grabbed flashlights and we all ran out there as a group and quickly disassembled the tent and grabbed what little supplies we had and bolted back to the house. Now, during the 30 seconds it took for us to disassemble what was already partially assembled, I swore to you that I could hear something big moving towards us and snarling. Now, when we made it back to the house, we decided to chill out and try to watch some TV, make some popcorn and forget about it. Now, at one point or another, I fell asleep, but a couple of my friends stayed up past me, and I remember being shaken by my one friend Jerry saying, "There's something really big outside, it's trying to get into the house." And he's whispering to me, he's pale and his eyes are wide. I shoot up out of my sleeping bag and I jump up and I don't see anything. I run, I close the blinds, we make sure the door is locked, and fortunately, nothing happens. About 20 minutes after that, we all hear this strange thud against the house and something big moving around. We were so beyond terrified, I'm surprised we didn't piss our pants. But nothing happened after that. And surprisingly, everything seemed okay. Now the following morning comes, my friends go home after the successful sleepover, and I decide to talk to my dad about what happens. Well, moving forward in time a little bit, I guess he eventually revealed some history on that particular house. Apparently, it had been built in the late 1800s by a very wealthy family in the area. And as you know it, this particular family had started a fairly popular coven, or so I'm told, in that time. And I guess from what he told me, the mother, the main maiden of the house, had, I think, 5 or 6 daughters. Each of them she forced to continually have babies to sacrifice and perform various rituals out in the woods around the house. Now, apparently, sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s, somewhere around the Great Depression, part of the house caught fire and burned down. I guess not the entire house, but a majority of the house, and it was restored and rebuilt over time and went vacant for many, many years. And I don't think it was until the 60s or 70s where it started having regular and continuous ownership, where people would keep putting back into the house. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, but apparently my father had spoke to quite a few people who had lived in the area their entire lives with their entire families. So it seemed pretty credible. Now, I can't speak personally about anything about witchcraft or any of that stuff because I'm not educated on it, but if any of that is remotely true, it might explain some of the weird things that I experienced in and around that house. The summer right before I started high school, my dad got a great job offer working for a big firm just outside of Pittsburgh. So we ended up moving, and I kissed that house and that property goodbye. I have no idea who owns it now, but hopefully they're unlike me and they don't have to deal with the stuff I did.